Today I'm roasting some squash. I have preheated the oven to 400 degrees. It's not really that picky. You can probably do it at 350, but it will take longer if you want to roast at a lower temperature. And I have rinsed the squash. I wasn't particular about getting all of the dirt off because we're not eating the skin anyway. So I just rinsed off some of the loose dirt that might get into things if it was still there. I'm going to start by cutting off the top of the squash. And then basically I just want to slit the whole thing lengthwise, but it's often easier to handle if you cut it in half crosswise first. And then I cut this half in piece crosswise. And then I will cut this in half crosswise. And then it's time to scoop out the seeds. I like to just use a regular big spoon for this because that has enough of an edge to scrape off all the stringy stuff without having to deal with a knife edge. And if you like, you can save these seeds, just kind of peel them out of this orange stringy part and roast the seeds. I only sometimes decide that this is worth the trouble. There you go. You want to remove most of the orange stringy part, but it really doesn't hurt anything if you're not meticulous and there's a little bit of the seed stringy part left in there. You probably do want to remove all of the actual seeds though. And you can see I hold the spoon like this with my thumb in the bowl for more control, and then I just take the edge and just move all around the edge of the seed area. And then just kind of scrape down underneath the best I can. You can often get it to all come out in more or less one piece like that. Once your squash is all prepped, you can put it on your baking sheet. Last time I did this, I forgot how much water the squash releases as it's roasting, and I used a baking sheet without sides. But unless you really like the smell of burnt squash juice and you love cleaning your oven, I would really recommend using sides on your baking sheets. And I can usually fit one squash per sheet. If they're a little large, you might have trouble fitting a whole squash per sheet though. I feel like I'm playing Tetris. There we go. That almost fits. It's not really going to matter that much that it's sticking over the edge. I probably will get a little bit of squash juice drippage, but it's not that big a deal. It should roast just fine. So now I'm going to put these in the oven, and really they just roast until you can stick a fork in them and they're very soft and tender, but plan on it taking about an hour. Here's the squash after 45 minutes to an hour in the oven at 400 degrees. I honestly forgot to look at the clock exactly when I put it in, so I'm not sure exactly how long it was in the oven. And I should point out that if you want more of cubes of squash just to serve as a side dish with a meal, something that you can kind of cut in chunks, you really only have to cook it for about 30 minutes, but I'm generally looking for a squash puree that I can use in casseroles or cook up with a little bit of sugar and cinnamon for breakfast. So I like to cook it until it is completely soft. And the fork goes in really easily. I can even actually poke it with my finger. It's cooled off just enough that I'm not quite burning myself doing this. And that, well, that was puffed up by steam there. But it's pretty easy to tell that it's soft enough when I can finger test it, and it's very soft. So now I'm going to let it cool, and then I can scrape the flesh off of the skin. Now that the squash is cooled, I'm going to go ahead and remove the flesh from the skin. And I'm going to freeze mine, but you can also, of course, go ahead and just use it right away. Normally I would just wait for it to cool to room temperature, but since I knew I wasn't going to get to it right away, I actually stuck it in the fridge. So the squash is cold now. Since I'm going to be freezing mine, I've already written on the bags that it's squash and the date, and then cost information. Each bag of squash is about $1 worth of squash. Normally I can fit half a squash in 1 quart freezer bag, which is about the right amount for 2 people. So I have 4 freezer bags here. And there are a couple different methods that you can use for removing the skin from the squash. If it's very soft, sometimes you can just peel it off with your fingers like this and it'll come off really nicely, like this piece did, which is perfect for demonstration. If you have trouble with that, or if some pieces are just a little more difficult to work with, the method that I normally like is to take a spoon and kind of scrape the meat of the squash out of the skin. And that also works really well most of the time. And I have resigned myself to the fact that there's just going to be squash all over my hands before I'm done here. And the nice thing about this spoon is that you can scrape off all of the squash residue. Sometimes when you're just peeling the skin off of the meat of the squash, there will be some left on the skin that's harder to get off with your fingers. And then if you're having any trouble with those methods, you can just go ahead and use a knife if your squash isn't quite as soft, for instance, and just peel it like you would peel a raw squash, except it's going to come off a lot easier than trying to peel it while it's raw. I definitely recommend roasting before peeling. And you can use this squash in a couple different ways. You can actually use it instead of pumpkin in a pumpkin pie. It'll be a slightly different flavor. You can also use the same method of roasting on pumpkin, and it's pretty much the same procedure. You can actually roast pumpkins whole if they'll fit in your oven that way, but of course it does take longer if you haven't cut them up at all. I like to serve squash for breakfast sometimes, in the winter especially. It's nice if you put it in the frying pan with just a little bit of butter and a little bit of turbinado sugar. You can also serve it as a side dish, slightly sweet like that, or you can add savory spices, of course, garlic and butter and things like that. And then of course you can also use it in any kind of squash casserole or squash soup. Half the peel on this particular piece is kind of sticking to the squash, so I'm going to go ahead and use the knife on that and just peel in nice little strips. And you should never cut towards yourself like that. This is terribly unsafe. And there's my roasted squash ready to go into the freezer. If you like, you can puree this in the food processor, especially if there are any hard or stringy bits that you notice. You can either do that all in one batch before you freeze it, or for specific bags when you unfreeze it. Either way works. And one last thing is, if you have a lot of squash water left in your pan, you can either throw that in any soup or stock that you're making, or you can throw it, if you have a bag of soup vegetables that you keep in the freezer, just throw it in there with your soup vegetables and add it to your next batch of soup.